In today's video, we're going to be looking at the most mysterious aerial and naval disappearances and crashes of all time. From the resurfacing of the greatest gambling ship of all time to the flight that led well-trained army pilots to disappear into the Atlantic. But first, let's take a look at one of the biggest search and rescue operations of all time, where all missing passengers are still yet to be found. Indian Air Force AN-32. Also known as the Antonov AN-32, the plane took off from the Tambaram Air Force Station at 8:30 in the morning of July 22, 2016. It was unexpected to land at around 11:45 in Port Blair. However, all radar contact was lost as early as 9:12 a.m. This incident launched India's largest search and rescue operation for a missing plane in history. Around 29 people were on board the aircraft. 6 crew members, 11 Air Force personnel, 2 Army soldiers, 1 Coast Guard, 1 Navy, and 8 defense civilians. Immediately on the day of their disappearance, a submarine, 12 surface vessels, and 5 aircraft were launched to begin the search. However, there were no smoke traces from a crash above the surface level in the search area. By the third day of the search operation, more than 16 ships and an additional 6 aircraft were deployed. They were all used to cover about 150 nautical miles of the Bay of Bengal. On August 1st, it was confirmed that the aircraft did not have an underwater locator beacon that could have eased the search. Almost 2 months after the disappearance, the rescue mission was called off. All 29 people on board were presumed dead, and all their families were notified of this tragedy. The Griffin. Lake Griffin's overall size is not known by many researchers, but it's widely believed that she was a 45-ton ship and the largest sailing vessel on the Great Lakes during the 1600s. The maiden voyage swept across Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan through uncharted waters that only canoes had once reached. The ship at first docked by Lake Michigan, where historical trading was done with the local tribes in the area. However, when they disembarked from the island to return home, the ship vanished along with all 6 crew members documented. There's been several theories popping up about their mysterious disappearance, but no clear consensus has been reached on how it reached its fate. But one of the most prominent pieces of information came from local legends by the tribes who believed that the ship was cursed to sink beneath the deep waters. Nearly 350 years later, a shipwreck was found beneath the waves of Lake Michigan, which are now believed to be the fabled Griffin. According to researchers, the design and structure of the wreck found are a good match for ships built during the time. There is no real visible indication that the ship was damaged by fire or by external attacks from raiders. Rather, they believe that a severe storm was what tumbled the ship to sea. The state of Michigan was adamant in disallowing intrusive excavation on the site for both wildlife preservation of the Great Lakes, as well as avoiding international uproar leading millions towards the lake. Scientists at the time believed they were being treated more as treasure hunters rather than experts by the state, and so they could only systematically agree with the state's decision by using non-intrusive techniques and remote sensing devices to gather evidence. It's still unclear today if it's truly the ship of legend, but it is only a matter of time before further exploration in the depths can give us answers. Aer Lingus Flight 712. It's been over 50 years since one of the most mysterious plane crashes in the world happened. The Aer Lingus Flight 712 had crashed into the sea near Tusker Rock off the coast of country Wexford on March 24, 1968. All 61 passengers and crew were killed, and for such a large-scale tragedy, it's shocking that until today, the truth of what happened on the plane on that day is still unknown. Unlike the hotter weather patterns we experience nowadays, Ireland's winter weather was far harsher with repeated snowfalls over months. The Aer Lingus flight was a routine plane that hopped across the Irish Sea from Cork Airport to London Heathrow. Aside from the intense weather, some attribute the crash to swans migrating during the time. During March, swans were known to fly to their breeding grounds in Iceland and Russia, and this led to some people to believe that the flight was caught in a bird strike. While bird strikes are plausible, more people aim their theories toward harsher possibilities, such as the aircraft getting shot down by a British missile. Perfectly positioned towards the flight path of the plane was the Royal Air Force Station, which was the UK's leading missile testing range. At the time, it was known that missiles were frequently fired at unmanned drones flying over the Irish Sea. However, the British Ministry of Defence immediately dismissed the claim of having anything to do with the crash. The aircraft was found 11 miles off the coast of Tusker Rock, and all bodies were then recovered. Although the Irish government was happy with how the search went, a report published later stated that the government actually didn't have enough resources to search and conduct a salvage operation. Public pressure led the government to reopen the investigation of the crash landing, but sufficient evidence was still very much lacking. The HMS Endeavour. 1768. British explorer James Cook left England on the HMS Endeavour for the South Pacific. He and his crew were the first European expedition to map the entire coast of New Zealand and were also the first to reach Australia's eastern coast. The crew was also responsible for collecting hundreds of unknown plant species. After their 3-year journey, it was time for Captain Cook to return to England, and although Cook and his crew became legends, the ship that brought them was not given as good treatment. The British Royal Navy seized the ship to use it in ferrying supplies for several years before it was sold to a private buyer. The ship was then renamed and, stay with me on this, Lord Sandwich, and then used to transport German mercenaries to fight for Britain during the American Revolution. I don't even really like ships that much, and it still deserves more respect. It was stationed as part of the Royal Navy's fleet in Newport Harbor and used to imprison captured American soldiers. However, when French reinforcements came to assist the revolutionaries, the British decided to sink their ships rather than them be captured. They then used the sunken ships to block the French from getting into the harbor. Over 12 vessels were sunk and some were set on fire, and although the French were able to take some equipment from these ships, it was never clear what happened afterward. By the 1990s, the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project began to identify any wrecks found. It was only then that they realized that the Lord Sandwich was the same ship as the HMS Endeavour. Because the ship played a vital role in Australian history, the Australian National Maritime Museum got involved with the project. Researchers believe the wreck to be located off the coast of Narragansett Bay, but it's still yet to be thoroughly examined. They then hope to finish their work before the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival in the South Pacific. Angermenefin SSS Baichimo. Probably mispronounced that. Many believe in the tale that somewhere out there in the vast ocean is a phantom ship that continues to sail without a crew. The ship in question is the SS Baichimo and was last seen in 1969 abandoned in the Arctic. To this day, there are no historical records of what happened to the ship and endures to be one of the most mysterious ghost ships of modern time. Originally called the Angermenefin, it was a Swedish steel-hulled cargo steamer. It was then used to transport goods between Germany and Sweden. During the World War, she was handed over to the British as part of Germany's war reparations and was then renamed the SS Baichimo. For the next 10 years, the ship got several expansions and upgrades to its steam engines that carried the ship during the frigid waters of Canada's coasts. On October 1st, 1931, the ship became stuck in packed ice near the Alaskan town of Barrow, the 11th northernmost community in the world. The crew decided to leave the ship for a couple of days as they warmed up in Barrow. However, the ship would experience more terrible cases of getting stuck in the ice to the point that the company decided to rescue all of its employees from the ship. Only 11 sailors and their captain decided to stay with the ship. After a massive snowstorm, the ship vanished. Several sightings were made of the ship by different people as the ship reached further and further north without its crew inside. After the last recorded sighting in the Truckee Sea in the Arctic Ocean, no one's ever seen the ship again. No wreckage has been found either, and it remains unclear if the sea has finally claimed her to the depths or if the SS Baichimo is still out there on an eerie odyssey. Air France Flight 447. The tragic crash landing of Air France 447 remains a shock of the past for the entire world. Because of the incredible safety records of the airline, the loss was difficult for many to understand and still remains a mystery to this very day. It's hard to imagine how a very well-trained crew during an ordinary routine flight could abruptly lose control of the aircraft. The AF447 was 3.5 hours into a night flight over the Atlantic, and during this time, the speed sensors of the plane had sudden bursts of inconsistent speed readings, which caused the plane to suddenly disconnect from the autopilot mode. This was a feature expected to happen whenever there was unreliable data happening with the sensors. With this, the startled pilot suddenly had to fly the plane manually. While one pilot struggled to maintain the manual flight, the other pilot was tasked to diagnose the problem, but they were already at very high altitudes at the time. Mind you, manual flight is much more restricted in higher altitudes, which is why pilots almost never have to fly manually up there in their entire lives. The pilots attempted to correct a slight tilt that happened, but it ended up getting overcorrected. The plane then rolled side to side sharply several times, but when the pilot suddenly pulled the stick backwards, the plane began to do a steeper climb that led to a free fall. The AF447 crashed into the ocean, and with it took all 228 crew and passengers. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact the plane, an aerial search was done to find it. It took around a week before the first few bodies were found along with their plane seats. It's still unclear what had happened during the sudden speed spikes that caused the autopilot to disconnect, but it's tragic either way. Flight 19. Like many aviation incidents, it all starts with a routine flight. When nothing is out of the ordinary, it's when the unexpected is bound to happen. On December 5, 1945, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers took off from the Naval Air Station in Lauderdale, Florida. The 5 bombers were collectively known as Flight 19, and they were scheduled to have their 3-hour flight exercise. With a triangular flight plan, they headed east toward Hens and Chicken Shoal for bombing runs. At first, Flight 19 was proceeding smoothly with their exercise, just like the 18 other flights earlier that day. But shortly after, the planes turned north for the next part of their journey, and strange things began happening. Pilots were convinced that their compasses were malfunctioning, which made them fly in the wrong direction. A sudden cold front blew in rain, strong winds, and heavy cloud cover. This in turn caused Flight 19 to become heavily disoriented, and was still able to radio in saying, "I don't know where we are." The flight instructor immediately informed the air station of the situation. The station was still able to get in contact with them and noted how anxious their voices were on the radio. The pilots were beginning to mention possible locations of where they were at that just didn't make sense based on their flight paths. With all the efforts to locate the Florida Peninsula, they ended up even further out to the sea. As they flew out further into sea, their radio transmission became increasingly faint. There was a haunting last transmission that was received by the air station, where the lead pilot in Flight 19 made their final decision of going down together into the sea once they no longer had enough fuel. Minutes later, only static remained in the radio communications. The Navy did search far and wide, over 300,000 miles, with more than 100 planes and 3 times more boats to look for the 5 missing planes. Until today, they've still not been found. Now it's time for today's best pick. Today's best pick is from a missing plane where all skeletal remains of missing passengers were found still strapped to their seats. Santiago Flight 513. September 4th, 1954. The Santiago Flight 513 took off from West Germany to arrive in Brazil 18 hours later. However, the plane was said to have disappeared mid-flight over the Atlantic Ocean. Authorities believe that the plane had crashed somewhere, and although multiple search parties were formed to search for the wreck and remains, nothing was found. 2 years after the disappearance, Santiago Airlines ran out of business after failing to find any traces of the missing plane. 35 years passed. On October 12, 1989, the Porto Alegre airport in Brazil spotted an unauthorized aircraft circling around the airbase. When the plane made a perfect landing, authorities approached the plane cautiously. Upon opening the doors from the outside, they found 92 perfectly preserved skeletons of the people on board still safely buckled into their seats. Even the pilot was still holding onto the controls tightly. But why hasn't this story become a legend around the world? Well, funny enough, the story is actually a fabricated tale that was published on old tabloid newspapers. Weekly World News was infamously known for publishing fictional stories in their newspaper at the time, and no other credible news sources could be traced regarding the incidents except that one newspaper clipping from 1989. So you can just say this one was a fooled you moment. The SS Monte Carlo. If you've ever been up to San Diego in your life, it's most likely that you've heard about their famed Coronado shipwreck tale. Just south of their Hotel del Coronado, there appears to be a ghost ship during heavy storms, vanishing once again into the sea by daybreak. The SS Monte Carlo was a concrete oil tanker that was then refurbished to become one of the most notorious gambling and prostitution ships in the late 1930s. Several Hollywood icons were even rumored to have been frequent visitors of the ship. However, during a storm in 1937, the SS Monte Carlo broke free from its anchor and crashed into the shores of Coronado Island. It was immediately abandoned and no one claimed ownership of the ship because of its illegal activities. All gambling-related paraphernalia was being confiscated and taken in by authorities, and just as the SS Monte Carlo sank, so did the many other gambling ships that had finally lost their days of light. Ships such as that were no longer welcome to anchor and operate above the law. Their era was finally over. As the waves grew higher, the ship with many tales untold from the once magical city within its steel hull were taken into the depths. Only when the storms end up with low tides are people able to see the remains of the ship until the days came when it was no longer visible. But back over in 2016 on the same beach coast, the SS Monte Carlo makes its appearance once more, and will continue to be a reminder of the days long gone.
Before we move on, I've got a little challenge for you that'll take 5 seconds to complete. So here's the deal. You just leave a like on this video, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, and you will get 25 years of amazing luck. Try it. It really works.
Malaysia Airlines MH370. Known today as the biggest and most famous missing aircraft in the world, the case of Malaysia Airlines MH370 still remains unsolved. On March 8, 2014, the plane disappeared amidst a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. With 227 passengers and 12 crew members, the search operations done were one of the most intense in history. All efforts stretched across continents to find the lost aircraft. The last transmission received was around 1:07 a.m. and was reportedly switched off thereafter. Even the plane's transponders were switched off during the last communication to air traffic control. At around 2:22 a.m., Malaysia's military radar lost contact with the plane over the Andaman Sea. Initial searches were focused on the South China Sea. Because no signs of the crash were found over the week, the search was widened. One search party was over by the Indian Sea towards the southwest of Australia, and another crossed through Asia from Vietnam over to Turkmenistan. Based on further analysis on the final radar signals received, the plane should have crashed in a remote region 2,500 kilometers from the Indian Ocean. Australian ships detected several pings that were possibly from the wreckage's flight recorded. However, the submarine dispatched in the wide area of the pings found no debris or leads. The first debris discovered was not found until more than a year later, when the right wing of the plane ended up in the French island of Reunion. Over the next year, 26 more pieces of debris have been found, but they were found all over South African coast this time. After 4 years of searching, the governments of Malaysia, China, and Australia called off the search. They then issued the final report on the disappearance, saying that it was likely an error from manual inputs of the pilot. Not a single body has been found to this day, but families continue to wait for any new leads that can finally close this tragedy. See you all next time!